The most basic social contract of all is work. You put in some amount of time that everybody agrees on is the right amount, and you get paid. And from that, you get to have a house, car, food, important things to get by in life. And you might very well think it's your money. But an economy is both competition and cooperation at the same time. It's something like a game, a level playing field. But think about that basic social contract. Think about how it has changed in the last 10 years, 20 years, how much you rely on video calls from people around the world that you never used to before. Think about how much automation has changed things, how many processes are now done automatically. And now think about what has happened to your work in the last few months. And you work and you get paid what? You get paid something called money. Well, what is money? These are the questions I want everybody to ask. And a good way of illustrating the question about what is money is this Brazilian Cruzeiro from the 1990s. And you might well ask, what is a Cruzeiro? The answer is this is what came before. You see, money itself can break. That's the problem. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is work? What is money? What is really anything? I have presented over the last few videos some situations that explain how bad it can be. That the US dollar itself is under a tremendous amount of pressure and has been for a long time. That we may very well have reached the breaking point. But what happens when you reach the breaking point? What happens when there is no money? What happens when there is no basic social contract as we have come to understand it? Now, this may seem like something that is just arising because of the virus. But if you're watching this months in the future, you know perfectly well that here in April 2020, we are in just the beginning of the fallout from all of this. What is going to happen? Well, we know there's a tremendous amount of debt because all money is debt. And the way the Brazilian Cruzeiro failed was the debt failed. Eventually, they had to come up with a new form of money, the real. This could happen to the US dollar, but if it happens to the US dollar, it happens to everything all around the world because the dollar is the standard of the world. Now, how could it happen? Well, we certainly have a situation where people aren't working and won't be able to pay their bills in the United States. That's going to cause a lot of pressure on the financial world. But don't forget that the same thing is happening in China because we're not going to be buying things from China. And while there is a tremendous amount of debt here in the United States, there is almost as much dollar backed debt in China that we have absolutely no control over. And world trade itself supports the dollar. So when that collapses, what happens to the dollar? And it's not just the US dollar. We know that money itself can fail. And that may be a permanent situation. See, when we talk about the deflationary pressure on money, which is debt, technology, overcapacity, and demographics, the aging of the population, four very strong forces. What happens is that with deflation, as money becomes more valuable with time, the time value of money breaks down. Debt, as we know it, is based on the time value of money. Money today is worth more than money in the future. You reverse that. What happens? And you say, how can that reverse? Well, the European Central Bank already has bonds that have a negative interest rate. You pay them for the privilege of parking this money, whatever the heck this money thing is, and you have to pay them for the privilege of it. Oil prices went briefly negative. Okay, here in the United States, the 10-year bond is yielding about a 0.5% right now. Almost nothing. You need to keep in mind that money itself might be breaking. And we have some basic fundamental questions. What is work? What is money? What is a nation? What do those words mean to you? Now, over the next few months, we're going to be seeing some very strange things happen. Right now, in the developing world, they're having food shortages that are just beginning. Again, if you're seeing this months from now, you know how bad it's gotten. And it might get bad in the United States as well, in the developed world. But it's likely to get bad all around the world. Certainly, some nations, like China, for example, imports at least 20% of its food. If the financial system breaks, people start to starve. And that may sound ridiculous, but the Arab Spring that started in Egypt back in 2011, I think it was, that came about largely because Egypt imports about 60% of its food. A financial collapse created starvation. Now, this is something that comes naturally from globalism as we've come to understand it. The same process that has brought peace and prosperity to the world has become very, very fragile. World trade itself can break down. Now, the virus is definitely a huge force that we didn't anticipate, but everything is breaking down. Why? Because there's too much debt. Because everything is done with no sense of resiliency whatsoever. Globalism or nativism? Should each country be self-reliant? Well, certainly in some key things like water and food and maybe energy. Every nation should be tightly self-reliant in some way. And every household should be somewhat self-reliant. But do you live from paycheck to paycheck? You know what kind of crunch you've had during this whole thing. It turns out that most small businesses live from one month to the next. It turns out that our government lives from one month to the next. There is no resiliency in the system at all. And that's because everything is taken up with debt. The more we make this, the more debt we have. The more this becomes brittle, the more likely it is to fail. The more likely that is the debt to fail. But can we think about the basic social contract? What is work? How has that changed? How is it likely to keep changing? What is money? What does it mean when there is no time value of money? What is a nation? A nation that issues these things that we're supposed to be using for exchange, or provides basic needs and takes care of us in a difficult time. What does any of it mean? These are the questions you need to ask, because I have my own answers to them, and I've given you some background as to why I think these questions are important. But that's all I was trying to say. I'm not providing solutions at this point, because everybody is going to have their own conclusions. What I can tell you is that the politics that we have been discussing for the last however many years is largely meaningless. We don't really even have the words to describe the world that is coming, let alone debate it, let alone have a useful politics, let alone actually get something done. We're having trouble describing the world we live in right now. That's the real issue. And it starts with simply thinking and asking the right questions. Because the pressures that everything is under are incredible. The amount of debt is amazing. The pressure from technology is only going to continue, as we have seen it march forward from the last 20, 30 years. So where are we going with this? The answer is, it's going to get a lot worse. Ask the people of Brazil, because they've seen what it's like to live through the death of the Cruzeiro. They were able to get by. But if the dollar becomes meaningless, the whole world will suffer. And we can reasonably expect severe food shortages coming up. We can expect a whole lot of things breaking that we never thought would break before. But let's start with those basics. What is the social contract? What does it mean to work? Work from home? How is that different? If we're going to devise a politics that is meaningful, that allows us to debate one choice versus another, we have to be talking about our future, not our past. All of the various isms like capitalism and socialism and whatever else you might want to throw around as shorthands for various things are largely meaningless. There is competition, there is cooperation, there is a general sense of belief because, as Adam Smith told us, all money is ultimately a matter of belief. How much belief do you have in the Cruzeiro? Well, that was the problem. So where are we going from here? It's not going to be good. Every single thing of any importance that makes up what we might call a social structure, and through that an economic structure, is going to be tested, and it may break, because we know that there is very little resiliency anywhere in the system. Before I talk about potential solutions, it might be good to talk a little more about how we got to where we are today, during the good times, before everything really broke. But for now, I hope everybody can simply sit down and think and ask some very fundamental questions. Questions that are as essential as your ability to put food on the table. In the middle of all this, you're probably struggling to do that. Months from now, what is it going to be like? It doesn't look like it's going to be much better. And I'm telling you that there's a very good chance it's going to be significantly worse, because every single thing is breaking. Start with the fact that money itself isn't functioning the way it's supposed to. Work out from there. It may be frightening, but we have to face it, because what choice do we have if we're going to survive? We have to work together. Forget the isms. Don't try to put a label based on the experience of the last 10, 20 years on what we're going to have to do in the future. Those labels are meaningless. We're talking about survival. We're talking about basic social agreement, social contract, and the maintenance of order, which is already in the developing world breaking down. And if you're watching this in the future, you'll know exactly what I mean. Okay? That's where we are at. And I would love to have your input on this, because we do need to be asking these basic questions, starting from an understanding that the pressure everything is under is extreme. Thank you.